So, the story of the effects of the Industrial Revolution are in the promotion of a global economy. That global economy is driven by the need for resources on the part of the industrializing nations. As more nations industrialize, more resources are needed. The story of resources is kind of the best case study for this is cotton. Previously, Britain had purchased their cotton from the 13 colonies and had then produced textiles at home. Now, cotton is not being sold at the same easy price in a mercantile system. It's more expensive to buy it from the US. Furthermore, England needs even more cotton because they've mechanized their textile production. That leads to the rise of a global economy and the establishment of other colonies, which were previous trade partners with Britain, as export economies. The clearest example of this is in India. India previously had grown cotton and traded with England. However, now England takes over, as they continue to take over more land with the British East India Company, start to grow more and more cotton on those fields. They then send that cotton back to England, no longer producing textiles in India. The same goes for Egypt. So if you see the change in two ways, export economy in some of these countries that now are just exporting cotton, and then the decline of local textile production, and this happens in other businesses as well, because of the industrialized powers there in Europe. Also, you see the kind of sneaky way of promoting trade and seeking new places to trade the products they're making. England is making more cotton than they can possibly buy, more cotton textiles. And so they want markets, places elsewhere, including China. And in order to get into China, to get the goods that they want from China, they have to be a little sneaky because China doesn't really need anything from Britain. They don't need textiles, they have silk, and they don't really need silver anymore. So the way that England gets around this is they also grow in India poppy. And by growing poppy are then able to sell opium over the border into China and produce a opium dependent market there in China. The effects of that are certainly the story of imperialization and the changes to China. However, they do come as part of the story of industrialization as Europe is seeking more marketplace there in China. Europe is also seeking at the time in greater amounts precious stones and metals. This leads to intensive mining, which certainly has environmental effects, but you see that in the gold mining in South Africa as well as India. You see the mining of copper in Mexico and the mining of diamonds in South Africa as well. Here's a picture of a South African mine in the late 1800s. It has African workers, Chinese workers, and even European workers. What's interesting about this is it highlights another global effect of industrialization, and that's in the form of migration, which is a story of its own. But we kind of mention here, notice how migration is driven by this need for industrial resources. Industrialization also inspires fear because it does inspire imperialism. As the countries need resources more and more, they take over more and more power. And existing empires, such as the Ottoman Empire and the Qing dynasty, are nervous as they watch these things happen. So their response is, well, we need to industrialize as well. This leads to the Tanzimat reforms as well as the self-strengthening movement in Qing China. Both of these movements are rather unsuccessful because they try not to change culture as they change the economy. And unfortunately, the Industrial Revolution simply changes culture. So by doing that, it compromises the effectiveness of their economic changes and therefore minimizes the effect, leading ultimately to social revolution in both places with the Young Turks and then with the Taiping Rebellion in Qing China. The Egyptians, however, under the leadership of Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, kind of revolutionized their own selves by distancing themselves from the Ottoman Empire while they still acknowledge allegiance and establishing their own cotton textile industry, making themselves kind of finding a new niche in the economy as Europe is shifting to the second industrial revolution, producing less cotton as a result. You also see changes in how finances are done. I'm going to talk about this pretty quickly, but you see transnational corporations becoming a thing. Of course, with globalization, that's not just limited to countries and empires, that's certainly going to be seen in economic companies. So you see, like the American company, the United Fruit Company, which produces a banana empire, as it were, in Guatemala and other parts of Latin America during this time. This picture is from 1890s in Jamaica and their banana plantations. Also, in a little more benignly, you see the HSBC starting during this time as bankers from England establish a transnational banking corporation, which includes Hong Kong. Here is a picture of where they're spread throughout the world even today to kind of give you an effect. But even at the time, in the 1800s, it was a transnational corporation. As transnational corporations are growing, they need investors, and the investing is made easier with the rise of a stock market and limited liability corporations. These corporations, such as the HSBC and others, actually promote and encourage investing because you're no longer, as an investor, held responsible for the debts and challenges of the company. So it allows that limited liability. You're no longer able to be sued simply for one company's business. With those changes, then, of course, lead major social changes. So we've looked at global changes, we've looked at economic changes. Let's look at more of an individual, personal, social change. See a rise in feminism. Women are now working, and they're working together. That's going to lead to conversations and rises in kind of gender issues and gender questions. There's also increased population growth, which leads to even more urbanization and concerns about the quality of life that people are experiencing in urbanization. People like Edwin Chadwick are going to lead reforms against and to change some of the negative health concerns there as people are living so closely together in tenement housing and the like. What's really interesting is also the idea of leisure changes. Leisure is now defined because the workday is now defined. When you're farming, the animals always need to be fed at some point. When you work in a factory, the factory closes down at some time in the day, and now you have what's called an evening. You have a weekend. You have the chance to go and watch sports and engage in more leisurely recreation. And so this really does change culture as a whole. You've been on your feet for 12 hours, but now you have a defined time where you are off. This is going to change the social expectations and the ability to unionize, the ability to gather, as I skip forward a little bit. All of this changes, of course, social class itself. The middle class rises that makes money off of their factories, not off of their connection to the king. This is going to kind of build upon the gentry, but be even a little lower than the gentry. So now you've got nobility who have titles from the king, gentry who made their money through the merchant class, but now are older money, and now this middle class, the industrial class. Then also workers themselves are divided between blue and white collar, as white collar workers require more skill or are more sedentary, and so kind of become a class of their own as there's social distinctions made there. Workers rise as they associate between themselves and fight for suffrage rights, union rights, and then sometimes even more violently against government and institution as itself in the rise of anarchism. Finally, the government responds, and you see certain responses. Again, I'm going quickly through these. You see the rise of a pension system in Germany, public education in America, and other promotion, again, of suffrage rights, particularly in England. A word on Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a middle-class man, interestingly enough, not a proletariat who he's going to fight for. He was part of the bourgeoisie, as it was, their money made by owning factories. But he had a friend, a revolutionary friend, Friedrich Engels, and together they are going to write a book in 1848 which revolutionizes the view of capitalism and really challenges it in a way that will not see significant effects or political response until more into the 1900s, but still raises questions which were certainly being asked by others, just with different solutions at times. He publishes as well Das Kapital, which is more of the fuller version of his capitalist system, and he does believe in class struggle leading to revolution. Basically, what Karl Marx does is he takes the ideas of Friedrich Hegel, who believed in the dialectic and the idea of change over time through conflict. And he says instead of conflict being challenged through ideas, it's challenged based on who has money. So he changes the dialectic into dialectic materialism, so if you can feel the money itself. And the idea of this is that there's a thesis, something that thesis itself produces something to go against it. And as the antithesis fights against the thesis, that produces a new system known as synthesis. You can read more, even in the Communist Manifesto, at how Karl Marx believes history itself is explained through this conflict. But in particular, what he was looking for was a system to challenge capitalism. He believed capitalism was the thesis, that it was the system in place, but that capitalism had produced an antithesis of its own. The proletariat, these workers who are oppressed by the bourgeoisie, who are not receiving the rights that are fair to them, fight against capitalism. And as they fight against capitalism, that will eventually lead, Karl Marx says, to the system of communism. However, communism will need a couple stages. And so in the Communist Manifesto, Engels and Marx promote the idea that socialism, a government-run system, will eventually lead into a proletariat-run system known as communism, where the government will disappear, all classes will disappear, and it'll be a system based on full equality. So it's kind of the dialectic materialism there really quickly, leading to revolution and change into communism. So communism ultimately is that system of society where there are no classes, but all resources are shared according to one's need. People don't do that naturally, Karl Marx agreed, and so he believed that socialism was the necessary step in which the government would come in, take control of all the factories, and give to each person equally. That would eventually lead to where people would take simply based on what they need.